Alberta's moratorium on renewables. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. The province of Alberta in Canada here has recently put a 6-month moratorium on further renewables development. And of course, this has caused quite an outcry. The province is citing issues with many of the farmers. They're concerned about contamination of agricultural land and how to deal with the recycling and decommissioning of wind and solar farms once they're done. It's been quite a boom town here in Alberta for wind and solar. One thing that people are not talking about is the destabilization of the power grid because of the volume of renewables that have quickly gone onto the grid and the drop in dispatchable power. So I'd like to address those issues today. I want to say from the outset, Friends of Science Society does not represent any industry or interests. We do not represent the provincial government. We do not represent any other organization. A number of our reports that I'll show you later on were written by either Robert Lyman, who's an energy economist with 27 years experience as a federal public servant, 10 years a diplomat, or by our professional engineering team, many of whom have direct experience in working on the Alberta power grid. So we're going to bring you some facts and information that you didn't get. You probably never heard of our reports unless you follow us, because the media has basically locked us out. And I'll also give you some indication of why and how that happened. So let's have a look at all the bits and pieces that I've put together here for you. This is a plain language presentation. You can find much more technical information in some of our reports, which were written by the engineers. So big news, lots of bluster. Pembina Institute claimed Alberta hits the brakes on affordable electricity projects. Environmental Defence was outraged with statement on the Alberta government's moratorium on renewable energy. I think they even invoked wildfires here. And National Observer, of course, Danielle Smith opens a new front in her war against renewables. I don't recall her ever having a war, but we'll see. You'll hear a lot more bluster from the Strathmere Group. Now, who is that, you ask? Well, Parker Gallant, a retired international banker, has been following a number of these environmental groups for years. Strathmere is kind of an umbrella group that, at the time he wrote this article, included all of these groups, and in fact, Pembina Institute initiated the Strathmere Group. It's like a under-the-radar informal umbrella. And as Parker found in a McConnell Foundation document, the Strathmere Group at the time have over 358,000 members, 420 staff, and annual budgets totaling over 50 million. So they're obviously a very powerful group when they act together, and they do strategize and act together a lot. And one way we know that is that Boothroyd Communications says that Strathmere Group, Greenpeace, Pembina Institute, World Wild Fund, etc. In 2014, we planned and facilitated the Toronto Skills Building Workshop, Campaigns and Communications 2014, where directors from Canada's 12 leading environmental organizations learned from leading market researchers, journalists, and organizers, and agreed to work on shared frames and messages in advance of the 2015 election, federal election. Now, ClimateWorks is based in the US. It's a kind of a conglomerate, if you like, of a number of big philanthropic organizations. And the partners of ClimateWorks fund environmental groups to push for global cap and trade. And they do that because wind and solar are the devices that generate renewable energy certificates, which are kind of like tradable monopoly money, if you like. So they have this plan called Design to Win. We have a copy posted on our blog. And this is the kind of money that they're putting out just from ClimateWorks, this is $600 million a year. Each of the ClimateWorks partners also make independent funding of very substantial amounts to environmental groups. And the idea of Design to Win was to fund these environmental groups to agitate for changes in policy and make it look like it was a grassroots desire of the local public. In this way, they kind of circumvented democracy. And why is this such a big deal about Alberta? Well, Dr. Danny Harvey wrote this paper in 2012 about the idea of wind energy to displace existing Canadian fossil fuel and nuclear electricity generation. And he appears in a panel which was hosted by Thomas Steyer, who's a big green philanthropist in the United States, and once had a campaign for president, if I recall. Anyway, he works quite closely with Michael Bloomberg. And the idea here is that basically we could have an east-west grid in Canada, and Alberta would be serving about 30% of the power generation from wind. That's why wind is such a big deal and Alberta is such a big deal. Now, that doesn't mean this is possible. We actually have a couple of papers showing that an east-west grid would be a catastrophe for Canada. It would put us at risk of national blackouts, would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. It's not quite as simple as just stringing together the interties between provinces and then, calling it a day. It's a very complex thing. So it's very important that due diligence be done on these ideas, and due diligence has not been done. We've done some of it, but at a preliminary level, of course. A full cost-benefit analysis would take years. So, what do we have here? Yes, well, on the Liberal campaign since 2005, East-West Power Grid has been a popular thing. The Acting on Climate Change report that came out a few years ago claimed that with its vast potential of renewable resources, Canada could reach 100% low-carbon electricity production in 2035. And they have this map, which unfortunately I covered up by Elizabeth May's comment. We can't make change without viable alternatives. An east-west electricity grid will fuel Canada's transition to renewable energy. Sign the petition. And even the LEAP manifesto, if you remember that. The latest research shows it's feasible for Canada to get to 100% of its electricity from renewable resources within 2 decades. By 2050, we could have 100% clean economy. We demand that this shift begin now. But in fact, this kind of push from all these environmental groups and activists has led us to the sad state that we find ourselves in today. And that is, we have a lack of dispatchable capacity in Alberta, and we are at risk of blackouts in critical times. So this screenshot here is an excerpt from the ISO, that's the Alberta Electric System Operators Current Supply and Demand Report, which was taken at 23:59 on December 31st, 2014. Dispatchable power, now that's a kind of power that is on demand. You can increase or decrease it at will, unlike wind and solar, which are entirely dependent on whether the sun shines or the wind blows at the right speed. So dispatchable power is crucial to keep the power grid up and running. So at this time in 2014, we had 6,000 plus megawatts of coal, 7,000 plus megawatts of gas, 894 megawatts of hydro, and other, which is cogen, 409. So leaving off the other category, that's 14,308 megawatts of dispatchable power. So now we look at this version. This is December 22nd, 2022 at 7:43 a.m. The dispatchable resource this morning is gas, 10,000 megawatts. Well, just almost 11,000, you see. So gas has gone up dramatically. Hydro, is the same. Energy storage, that's a new thing, but this is a very small amount. This isn't a long-term provider of energy. It's for load shedding and when there's a sudden shift and you need a bit of power to fill a gap. Dual fuel, this is 466 megawatts. That's the conversions of the coal plants. And coal is 820 megawatts of coal. So you see, we used to have 6,271 megawatts of coal. Now it's 820. So combined, that makes up 13,144 megawatts. So yes, we have 1,000 megawatts less dispatchable power than we did in 2014. But we've added huge amounts of renewables. So you can see these a bit closer here. And so you can see here back in 2014, we had only 1,434 megawatts of wind. This is in maximum capability here. This is the total net generated at that particular time. There's also a thing called the interchange or intertie. This is between the other provinces, and sometimes we export power to them, sometimes we import power. So whenever there's a minus symbol, we're importing. And now you can see today, what do we have? So gas is 10,000 versus 6,000. Hydro is the same. Energy storage is new, but very nominal. Solar, which was not on the chart at all then, it's 1,138. And wind is 3,618. So that's very substantial. That's a huge change from this. And that all happened since 2014. But we're short on dispatchable power. And what happens? We got grid alerts last year. Last year we had 7 grid level 3 alerts. So this one was on December 20th, 2022. And the Alberta Electric System Operator declared a grid level 3 alert about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And you can see the internal load was 1,277. We were importing 681 megawatts from our friendly neighbors. And wind and solar were not performing at all. There was 0 solar, of course, in December. The sun goes down very early. Wind was only 47 megawatts out of 3,618 possible maximum capacity, and it was extremely cold. So of course that means that everyone has, the heat turned up, the lights on, it's near Christmas, people have Christmas lights on their house, they're probably doing some housekeeping because December 20th, visitors will be coming, so maybe the washer, dryer, dishwasher are all going. So we're like dying with renewables. We were importing at a pool price of $999 per megawatt because there's not enough gas and coal capacity. So it's also costly for us to import, although it saves us from going to blackout. But this is really the crux of the problem, in our opinion, at this point in time. This is the biggest issue to be concerned about. Because we had 7 grid level 3 energy emergency alerts in 2022 in Alberta. This information comes from the Alberta Electric System Operators 2022 Annual Market Statistics Report. So there were 7 grid alerts declared. When it's declared, the ISO is unable to meet minimum contingency reserve requirements and firm load interruption is imminent. That means a blackout, rolling blackouts, perhaps cutting off one of the large consumers, perhaps some industry might be shut down. And quite often in a case like that, and I can't speak to whether or not those arrangements are in place, I assume they are, but there are some industries that make an arrangement, big power users, who in a crisis like this would agree to have their power supply shut down. They might have an alternative form of maybe diesel generators on site, maybe their own little power plant that they could run for a certain period of time, but they might agree to do that, and of course they would be paid some kind of compensation, but it would keep the grid from blackout. Again, I don't know if that's the case. That's commonly how these things are set up in other jurisdictions. So during 2022, the ISO was able to manage the grid alerts such that no firm load was shed, but these events occurred in the latter part of the year, 2 in September, 1 in November, and 4 in December. And each event occurred during a period of extreme seasonal demand, and there were other precipitating factors, but low renewable generation was certainly one of them. Now, the other thing, since we phased out most of the coal, our reserve margin is down, but demand is up. So it says here, low wind generation accompanied each of the grid alert events, and the decrease in reserve margin was a result of approximately 670 megawatts less installed thermal unit capacity and an increase in the peak system load of approximately 460 megawatts. So we have a decrease in dispatchable power, and we have an increase in demand. And so this graph shows that drop-off here. So the drop-off, the reserve margin is 12% without the intertie to our neighbors and 22% with it. So let's look at that. And again, this is from that same report. Low reserve margins. Thankfully, we have good neighbors. So you can see we used to have a very high reserve capacity in 2019, but as coal has gone off grid, well, here we are. It's pretty low. When we add in the interties, we're almost back to where we were in 2020, but a lot of times other provinces cannot provide us with additional power, especially because weather conditions tend to be similar in regions. So when it's freezing cold in Alberta, it usually also is in Saskatchewan and Montana, so they need to keep power for their own operations. So it looks like we've actually gone too far, too fast. And here's the Herald reporting, a rush in Alberta, province sees a flood of renewable projects with more growth to come. Well, that sounds good. And they say, oh, look, the program's bringing $100 million in payments to the province. It saved another $60 million in surrendered carbon offsets. But actually, it's going to cost consumers billions. In fact, it already cost us billions to phase out coal, but it's going to cost billions more because we need to build additional conventional backup generation to match all of these intended new renewables. So how did we get here? Well, we got here because Pembina Institute issued this report, a costly diagnosis, claiming that people were dying from coal stack emissions, even though the newest coal plants in Alberta were very, very low emitters. And they claimed that we would save $3 billion a year in health costs by phasing out coal. It cost us at least $22 billion to phase out coal, and now it's costing us more to integrate renewables on the grid. So I don't think it was such a great deal. Anyway, of note, this research was made possible by generous financial support from the Oak Foundation, which is in Switzerland, the Pembina Foundation, as well as the Canadian Health and Environment Education and Research Foundation, which I don't think is around anymore. But anyway, the Oak Foundation is in Switzerland. And here's an ad, accelerated phase out of coal-fired power in Alberta. And you can see that, oddly, all of the medical people in Alberta supported this. You would think that they would want reliable, affordable, coal-powered electricity, but I guess not. And here's Dr. Vipond in his scrubs and stethoscope. Anyway, so what happened is that there's been quite a bit of foreign funding to change policy in Canada. And here's a stack of some funds to the Pembina Institute from the Oak Foundation, which is in Switzerland. and is part of the Climate Works group that I showed you earlier. So this is a better close-up of these grants. So they're supposed to develop scientifically accurate analysis and raise raise awareness among Canadian public on the need for slower and more environmentally responsible tar sands development. It sounds like interference in Canadian policy, doesn't it? Pembina advances clean energy solutions through research, education, consulting, and advocacy. So that's like almost $500,000 US, I believe these are all in US figures. You can see, as for scientifically accurate, they used a coal plant that's not even in Alberta when they went to the coal phase-out propaganda. This is what the Genesee power plant looked like at that time. Not really a large emitter. And you can see here they got another couple of $500,000 US grants. And all of these are to push clean energy. And this is even to make sure that the efforts to create interest in renewable energy are not thwarted by opposing forces. I guess that would be people like us. And also that they were to supply the US policymakers with accurate and unbiased information about Canada's oil sands operations and climate policy. Well, I guess we can take a cue from that. And they also got this money from the US, which is another foreign funder, the Energy Foundation. So here's another more than $500,000, and this is to support education and outreach to build a clean energy future. So what's my point here? Well, I just want to bring it to your attention, whether you loved, hated, or despised the Freedom Convoy, the whole principle of the Emergency Act was that they were supposedly funded by foreign sources and that they were trying to change policy in Canada. So I'm just putting that out there. Think about it. So Pembina's filings with Canada Revenue Agency, in 2018 we find they had like $1.7 million in revenue. In 2019 it suddenly jumps to $6.5 million, and then up again in 2022 to $7.2 million. This seems like quite a substantial leap. Not saying that it's, wrong or illegal, but it's a big leap. You can also see that they're getting government funding, they're getting other kinds of revenues, and they're getting other revenues from registered charities. And, that's not really our expertise, but we do find it interesting. Meanwhile, coal phase out in Alberta gutted 30 communities, 7,000 jobs were lost, and it turns out that we've actually been financing coal phase out in other countries. And hardly coughing up anything to help our coal workers who lost their jobs. So let's go back to 2017 at the Alberta Electric System Operator, the supply and demand. You can see that we had energy security then, and here's what I mean by that. This is a breakdown of who consumes Alberta's electricity, and this is based on 2016. It might have changed somewhat to date, but I think it probably is about the same. So we have industrial, commercial, residential, and farm. And industrial are by far the largest consumers. So they definitely need reliable, affordable power. And for supply, at that time, we had almost matching supply from natural gas at about 7,000 megawatts and coal about 6,000 megawatts. And the benefit of that is that these are both very reliable, very powerful forms of power generation. But natural gas is a market commodity, so it's quite subject to big swings in price. And then if you have coal, which we own a lot of coal in Alberta, then you can also play that off against the prices. So if the price of natural gas is very high, you could theoretically use more coal power. And you can see here we only had 2,776 megawatts of renewables at that time. We're up around 5,000 or 6,000 now. And just to put this in perspective, in the plant decommissioning, all of the old coal-fired power plants were going to go offline by 2030 anyway. The only ones that would be allowed to continue operating were the most modern facilities, and they would have operated to the end of their useful life. But no, the NDP wanted to overturn federal legislation and force all of the coal plants offline. And ironically, this is from the Alberta Electric System Operator 2022 market stats. You can see that coal is still king, because in 2022, with only 820 megawatts of coal operational, coal assets had a capacity factor of 92%, meaning for every 100 megawatts of installed capacity, coal assets generated 92 megawatts each hour. So they're a real performer compared to, well, all these others. Here's solar, here's wind. So about that net zero 2035, here's a definitive statement from an engineer at the ISO as to the annualized wind and solar generation in Alberta in 2022. Wind and solar generation represented 8.8% and 1.4% of the electricity generated in Alberta, respectively. So, fossil fuel-based generation is still above 80%. So much for net zero electricity by 2035. And there's lots of issues with renewables and net zero. For instance, here, let's have a look at this little list. Alberta has 1,000 megawatt shortage of dispatchable power generation versus what we had in 2015. Population is growing, industry is growing, more reliable power is needed overall. We're also developing these niche markets like electric vehicles and decarbonization for homes. So some people are moving to electrical heating instead of gas, but that will substantially drive up demand. There's a lot of anti-natural gas NGOs who now want to shut down natural gas use, and today our grid is mostly natural gas fired. And there's a couple of about 1,000 megawatt new gas plants that will soon go online. That will help alleviate the problem, but it won't solve it if we add way more renewables. It'll just recreate the same problem. Equipment and material supply chains may not be there for net zero plans. And by that, what I mean by that is, almost all the Western countries are all in this rush for net zero 2035, net zero 2030, 2050, but they all want to buy the same kinds of things. So the price of copper has skyrocketed, the price of coal has skyrocketed, the price of lithium has gone up. So, it's created this domino effect that everything that you need to go green is getting very, very expensive, and supply chains are messed up from COVID lockdowns to begin with, but there may simply not be the material supply chain there, and really very little due diligence has been done on that by the federal government. So now, transmission and distribution upgrades are costing consumers a fortune because wind and solar farms are typically far from where the consumer hubs are, where the cities are. So you have to build transmission and distribution lines, but those lines are very expensive, and yet you're only getting a small portion of energy return because the wind and solar farms are not high capacity performers. So it's actually an additional cost, if you like. And unreliable wind and solar drive up power prices. They're not free or affordable. And blackouts are the risk, and they cause tremendous economic and reputational damage, and of course can have catastrophic health consequences depending on how long they last. And did we save the planet by phasing out the coal plants that we did? This is a comment that was sent to me by a power generation engineer at the time. And he was talking about the problems with wind versus the type of natural gas plants that would be backing them up. And he said the problem with wind is its randomness. Wind is completely uncorrelated with demand. So that means quite often it's very windy in the evening, but after the peak, the dinner time peak. So you have wind generating all this power that you don't need. So quite often you end up just exporting it, but it's subsidized power. This is a situation that Ontario has found itself in now for well over a decade. So he says if the Alberta government adds another 5,000 megawatts, then the total wind capacity would be about 6,500. And we're floating around there. Typically, this amount of wind would randomly experience 80% or higher ramps one or more times a week. That means it would ramp up 80% of the load and back off again at least one or more times in a week. This would be the equivalent of ramping 6.5 Shepard natural gas plants from off to full to off again. These plants are unable to do this over the long term. So these gas plants are backing up the wind that's randomly ramping up or down. So the plants are unable to do this over the long term, and they may end up having to put in simple cycle units, which instead, from a CO2 perspective, would pretty much defeat the purpose of adding wind, which was supposedly to reduce CO2 emissions, right? But he goes on to say it's never really been about reducing CO2. It's all about building wind and now solar, with the new government statement about going 50% solar. So that was written back in the day when the NDP were implementing all of their very stringent goals for 30% renewables on the grid. And I mentioned energy security earlier. Alberta does own about 800 years of high-quality, low-sulfur coal, and it's surface mineable, which is a very good thing because it's easier to reclaim and it's not very dangerous to mine for the workers. So this graph is from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. It shows you that coal prices are fairly stable over the long term. They have recently gone up because of COVID lockdowns and the bounce back, and China is aggressively turning itself into the world's manufacturing plant. It's a program called Made in China 2025. So they're gathering up as much coal as they can. But you can see here how natural gas prices really skyrocket and then drop down again. And so it's very unstable, very unpredictable. And that's what's happened in Europe, of course, with the conflict in Ukraine and the loss of gas supply from Russia. The natural gas prices for Europe are at an all-time high. They're buying natural gas from anybody that they can, and they quickly put together some floating LNG platforms so they could import. I think they're getting a lot of it from the States, so it's really big benefit to the US, not getting any from us because we're only going to sell them hydrogen if we ever build that plant. But the point is that natural gas prices are through the roof around the world. And so if you have coal as a counterpoint, then you can save yourself. And certainly in Germany, they've gone back to coal. So that's what's powering a lot of Germany. But we have another problem that no one's really talking about, and that is that the global wind industry may be close to deflagration. So on June 22nd, the announcement by Siemens Energy of serious difficulties linked to the aging of the components necessary for the manufacture of its wind turbines had the effect of a veritable bombshell, panicking international finance. In one day, the action of the world's second largest manufacturer of wind turbines fell 37% on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, a loss in value of $8 billion. And that's kind of what I mentioned earlier, that the costs of production are really going up. and they're actually selling at a loss. Now, what the Alberta government said it's most concerned about are rural concerns about farmland quality being at risk because of wind and solar. The leaching of toxic elements, the lack of decommissioning obligations or recycling, a lot of those things have not been worked out to the satisfaction of many Alberta farmers. And really, what do we do with the waste? So the working life of solar panels and wind turbines is about 20 years. And then after, you're stuck with all this junk. So down in the States, they're just burying these wind turbine blades. And I understand that a lot of solar panels are simply dumped in Africa. So that doesn't sound very environmentally friendly to me. And actually, the whole wind and solar as clean and green is really a lie. These are neodymium miners in China. Their entire region is a toxic wasteland, and people are dying and plants are dying. Wind turbines burst into flames. Firefighters are helpless because they're too high, can't do anything about it. Raptors, eagles are being killed by them. These are rare birds. We're not talking about sparrows that fly into your glass window. We're talking about rare birds. And this is a little note about how previous reclamation was done. 60 tons of concrete was reclaimed from the Taylor Wind Farm. This is TransAlta, and they spread it alongside the foundations at a hydro facility as erosion control, which avoided 60 tons of concrete going to the landfill. So in a way that's good, but really what they just did is they scattered 60 tons of concrete alongside a water body in Alberta. And who really benefits from renewables jobs? We keep hearing there are going to be all these jobs in Alberta for people working in the renewable sector, but it actually creates renewable jobs for other countries. And this is by Robert Lyman. He points out that don't be confused by the names. Canadian Solar has headquarters in Canada, but its manufacturing base is in China. In fact, 6 of the top 10 solar panel manufacturers are Chinese. And I spoke about wind earlier, so these are some of the dominant wind manufacturers in Europe, but they're all in trouble. So price pressures from auctions, higher raw material and logistics cost, plus the Ukraine war have led to an unsustainable situation. So are we then going to be propping up a dying industry? Because, if we can't get parts, then we'll have all these things that don't work at some point that need parts that we can't get. And is wind and solar actually a solution to climate change or global warming? Well, no. Google engineers say that renewable energy won't solve climate change. They were given an endless budget, no limits. They worked on it for years and found that actually wind and solar can't compete with coal. And this new research shows that wind actually raises ambient temperatures, as do solar panels. So that's the exact opposite of what you want. And how about net zero 2050? Well, this is the total energy supply graph of Canada from the IEA, and it shows you just how much wind and solar we have versus all of the rest of the energy forms. And you can barely see this very thin little yellow band here. So that's oil, this is biofuels and waste, this is hydro, this is nuclear, this is natural gas, and this is coal. So we're not going to be going net zero anytime soon unless we're just trading off carbon credits. And by contrast, here's China. So China's total energy supply, you can see that they're very coal heavy, And even though people like to say, oh, they're a leader in renewables, well, in a way they are, because they're building a lot of them, but it's completely dwarfed by their use of coal and oil and biomass. And you can see here, China is the #1 coal consumer in the world. And look how far it outdistances everyone. And here's Canada. Can barely see it. Now let's compare electricity generation by source. So the previous graph was the total energy. Now this is just electricity for Canada and just electricity for China. And you can see here that we're mostly hydro. So our grid is very, very clean. And here's the wind and solar for Canada. Again, it's very tiny. That can't run our modern economy in any way. Can't support our industry. And for China, again, wind and solar are very nominal compared to their coal use for their electricity generation. And just to put things in perspective, this is Canada's electricity generation, where it sits versus China's electricity generation. We're nothing. And of course, people are always saying, well, we're trying to save the planet, we want to shut down coal, we want to reduce emissions. But in fact, China emits in 1 month about what Canada emits in 1.5 years. So no matter what we do, we're really literally a drop in the ocean. And if Canada were wiped right off the map, it would make absolutely no difference to global emissions. So here's a couple of projects that we wrote about. This is just a little blog post about the village of Carmangay, which created a solar project for itself. And I'll let you read the entire thing at your leisure. But a key point is that the Carmangay solar project's electricity is 7 times more expensive than the gas-fired electricity it is displacing. So, and also a point made here, moreover, as we retire existing coal plants and add more intermittent and highly variable renewable generation to the grid, the need for flexible and efficient gas-fired generation will only grow. Here's another one that we wrote about reality versus fantasy. And here, this is critiquing an article that was in the Calgary Herald about solar for homes. So we just use an example from Calgary. Let's say a consumer uses a constant 855 kilowatt hours per month. Then the rooftop solar panels produce 464 kilowatt hours too much energy in July and 473 kilowatt hours too little in December. So, people often say, well, let's just build some batteries because that would back it up. So again, I'll let you read the detail yourself, but the cost of battery backup for each home solar energy system would be $1.3 million, and that would have to be repeated every 10 years, which is the expected battery life. Now imagine one of these for every dozen homes in your neighborhood. So this is about the size of a soccer pitch, okay? So it says here, the project consists of 3 Tesla lithium-ion battery storage groupings and is slightly smaller than a soccer pitch. So that's the 20 megawatt hour battery energy storage facility, which is down by Pincher Creek, and it costs $16 million. Again, I want to go back to the point about foreign funding to change policy. Remember, we saw that Environmental Defense had come out with a statement. Again, the Swiss-based Oak Foundation granted Environmental Defense Canada about $500,000 US in 2010, and this was for mandating the reduction of tar sands emissions and introducing additional regulatory requirements for the industry. And they also want to ensure that Canada's cap and trade system is as strong as possible to close off loopholes for the tar sands industry, such as intensity and weak compliance options. And it seeks a federal permit system for tailing ponds and at least $5 billion in new incentives for renewable energies and energy efficiency from federal and state governments in 2010. So they're trying to change Canadian and Albertan policy on energy, and they're using foreign funding. So some of you may say, great, that's saving the planet. Others may say, wait, that's foreign interference. That's why the Freedom Convoy was stopped by the Emergencies Act. And we wrote this call to retract a University of Alberta report on renewables. That's where this segment comes from. It also is in another one of our reports. But it's interesting that the University of Alberta, in their social sciences division, they have been assessing the barriers to renewable energy development in Alberta, evidence from a survey on wind energy with rural landowners. So this report and survey was funded by Social Science Research Council in Canada. So you actually have these social scientists at the U of A trying to figure out how to talk rural landowners into getting on board with renewables, even though right now we have the Alberta government calling for a moratorium because they're very concerned for the quality of agricultural land, for toxic waste, for decommissioning. And, you know, it's ironic because many of our people are graduates. Many of Friends of Science members are graduates of the University of Alberta, mostly in the sciences, geosciences and engineering. And our people understand the real issues with wind and solar and grid operation and the toxic waste. The social sciences department is trying to figure out a way to talk farmers into getting on board with renewables. So that's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? So all this foreign-funded climate activism and coordinated push for renewables has put Albertans and the Alberta power grid at risk, right? So we were at serious risk last fall 7 times of potentially hitting blackout conditions, rolling blackouts, brownouts, and these policies came from this foreign-funded climate activism, not from good policy. So we have 4 reports about the foreign funding and the activities of these groups. This was written long before the Alberta inquiry. These came out in 2019. Robert Lyman wrote them. The material in them comes from public documents in the CRA and the IRS. So there are no surprises there, but the benefit of reading these is with Robert's long experience in the federal government, he can also extrapolate and address the implications of what the climate activists and renewable advocates and their activities and subsidies mean for the tax base and for the rest of us. So I really recommend that you read these. They're short. They're each about 10 pages. Quite a quick read, but pretty surprising material. And like I said at the outset, we have written a number of reports. This isn't all of them, but it's a good starting point. So we did one on the clean electricity standard. This is the push for the east-west grid, the 100% renewables type of powering of Canada. I've just shown you that that's technically impossible without the advent of some new technology, and certainly not possible in the timeframes being mentioned. The true cost of wind and solar in Alberta will give you a very different picture of the so-called free and affordable and so-called clean electricity. What you really need to know about renewable energy that the Pembina Institute won't tell you, an important part of this talks about base load and why it's so important. Dire consequences we put out just around the time of coal phase out, we were trying to convince people that blackout is a real risk. And we used the example of the UK. And indeed, this is how they spent most of their winter, teetering on the edge of blackouts. And this is called In the Dark on Renewables. This is from 2018, but it also gives a very good overview of why and how wind and solar are very complicating for the grid, and they're not the performers that people think they are. Robert Lyman also wrote these 3 reports. In Broken Promises, he addresses about 23, 24 preferential treatments that wind and solar developers get that no other energy industry gets. Empty Wallets addresses why renewables won't offer resilient recovery. And Empty Pockets. This is what happens. Renewables are expensive. So have a look at those, and please join us for Friends of Science 20th Annual Climate Science event, which will be October 17th, 2023, from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. at the Red and White Club at McMahon Stadium in Calgary. You can see Robert Lyman there. He will talk about when will climate policy hit the wall. He was here in 2017, and his topic then was, can Canada survive climate change policy? At the time he was optimistic, now not so much. And also Dr. Ian Clark, Emeritus Professor, A Reality Check on Climate and Net Zero. So break free from climate tyranny with evidence over ideology. I hope you'll come to our event. You can order tickets online right now. Early bird pricing is off, but if you become a member, you get a bit of a discount. And I thank you all for joining me for this discussion. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. We'll try and answer them. Again, I just want to say these are our perspectives on the issue of the moratorium. We don't represent any industry and don't represent the government or any other party, just ourselves. Just a bunch of professional geoscientists, professional engineers, business people, and citizens trying to put some common sense back into the climate and energy discussions. We stand for open civil debate on climate and energy and full cost benefit analysis before we get into the weeds on these crazy net zero schemes. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll post the PowerPoint on our blog as well so that you can go through and click on the links. I appreciate your time. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.